Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Carney. I'm the Executive Director of the Career Industry Council of Australia, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to be able to welcome you to day 2 of our CICA Summit. I would like to start by making an acknowledgement of country. So in the spirit of reconciliation, the Career Industry Council of Australia would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I acknowledge that today we are hosting this webinar from the lands of the Whadjuk people. We pay our respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples participating in this webinar this afternoon. Just some housekeeping before we kick off, just to let you know that today's summit session is being recorded. So if for whatever reason you might experience any technical issues throughout the course of the next hour and a half, we would just ask you in the first instance to try refreshing your screen. If that doesn't work, you are able to log out of the session and just make sure that you use the Zoom link that you were provided to log back in. We'll be using the chat button for comments throughout the course of this afternoon. And for those of you that were able to join us yesterday, you will notice that there was quite a bit of vibrant discussion through the chat function. So we would really encourage you to get involved this afternoon. It's not designed to sort of just be a sit and listen. It is designed for you to be able to provide any thoughts or comments you might have either about Serena's keynote presentation in particular, or anything that our panel members might be saying. If you do, however, have a specific question for a panel member, we would ask you please to use the Q&A button for that. It just allows us to be able to identify that much easier. If you're also wanting to participate on social media, we would welcome that, and we would just ask you to use the hashtag CICASummit21 so that it can be easily identifiable by anyone who might be interested. So to kick off this afternoon's session, what I would like to do is to provide you with a summary of Serena's keynote. You'll notice from an email that you received from us prior to today's session that due to the time difference between Australia and Canada, it wasn't possible for Serena to be able to present live. Well, it was actually possible, but we weren't going to ask her to get up at midnight to be able to do it. She was very appreciative of that. But obviously that did provide us with an opportunity of being able to give you that keynote to be able to view before today's session. If you've not had an opportunity to view that keynote, then this summary will give you an overview of what Serena spoke about, but it would also, you can also go back and watch the keynote after today's session if you choose. So I think Serena spoke, or her presentation was around the big 5 W questions that she identified, and that was who, what, where, when, and why. And very much she, I suppose, posed a question for us to shine a spotlight on some of those big questions that we need to be asking ourselves as we start to think quite strategically and to proactively build the future of our field. And so she started off by talking about sort of who is the client. And you can see on your screen in the top, on the far left-hand side, where we're sort of starting from. And I think she was talking, well, no, I don't think, I know that she was talking strictly that individuals were about seeking services, or should we actually think more broadly about that? And who do we as a field need to be looking to for inspiration for new thinking and for new approaches, which is very much the design of this particular summit. She spoke about the fact that our field has largely been entrenched in traditional one-on-one based counselling models in which the person sits across from us as a client. And she challenged us to broaden our thinking. And part of our role needs to be about identifying and reaching out to those who aren't actually knocking at our doors. Those who may need our services, but for various reasons may not be accessing them. She then posed the question about employers, and were employers seen as our clients? And was, as part of our role, we might have a role in helping employers directly support the ongoing career development of their employees. And if we worked in a school setting, very much about how do we support schools to integrate career development directly into the classroom, linking whatever subjects that their colleagues and teachers should be teaching in real life work applications. She also spoke around the notion of the social service system, and it sort of picked up a little bit on what Deirdre was also talking about yesterday in her keynote, is about how do we network and link with other human service providers? How do we make sure that we put the person at the centre and the types of services that they require? How do we work with those types of organisations to elevate our practice? She also focused on resource developers and creators of LMI labour market information, funders and policymakers. So she spoke about some key segments of the market where we're having to reach out. And I think she made a really interesting point where she was saying, if we're not reaching more widely in our field, we will remain dangerously hidden, limited in terms of potential reach, limited in terms of impact, and seriously fragile in terms of funding. She then said, she then posed the question, who should we be seeking out in order to help us shape the future of our field? Who will provide the expertise, the new perspectives and the inspirations that we need to grow and further reach our impact? There's very much a notion, she said, that we only talk to each other within our sector. And this, she says, provides risks, not only reflecting what has been rather than what could be. She provided an example of a career practitioner in Canada who went to a conference, and he turned up to the first session of the career development conference, but then took himself off to all the other conferences that were occurring in the convention centre at the time. And when people asked him what he was doing, he argued that engaging with different professions, with different perspectives and different solutions got him out of the box and thinking in new and creative ways about the career profession. She then moved on to the second W, which was what? What is our scope of practice? Do we have a shared understanding within our field? Do we have common language and common boundaries with respect to what's in and what's out when it comes to career practice? And I suppose Deirdre also spoke about that yesterday. And the notion, we've obviously seen that notion of an increase in potentially clients and citizens with mental health challenges. And we need to make sure, as we pointed out yesterday in the Catalyst panel discussion, that as career practitioners, we need to stay in our lane, that we are not experts in mental health, but we do have a part to play. The third and the fourth W's was the where and the when. Where do we offer our services and when are they accessible to those who need them the most? She argued that too many of us operate a very passive model of service delivery. Basically, working effectively for our field is more important than the needs of most. She challenged us to think about, what if we started offering our services in unexpected places? What if we went to the people that need our services about where they live and where they hang out virtually, rather than waiting for us to come to them? And if we work with students, she posed the question, do we spend enough time in the classroom where we have a captive audience helping students to see the connections between academic learning and possible futures? That whole notion of embedding into the curriculum. Are we actively reaching out to meet underrepresented groups where they live and where they feel at home? Another key point that I think also Deirdre picked up yesterday. And she finished with this particular W by saying, finally, and perhaps most importantly, why do we practice? What is the impact of our work? What is the change that we want to have in the world? And if we know our why, how do we actually know we're achieving it? Are we actively collecting evidence and shared data that demonstrates that we are succeeding and making changes? I thought another key point that she made is that people don't seek our services to maintain the status quo. Very few people seek out the service of a career practitioner just to maintain what they're currently doing. They're wanting to change their life. And she said that our job is to support them in making informed choices and to skillfully and strategically navigate these changes, articulating the ways that our clients want to change. She also spoke about the fact of using bad metrics to evaluate our career services, especially when funding is tied to those metrics. And so what she said is that we need to challenge the metrics that are used in order to evaluate our services. Because if our services are tied to the funding metric, we erode the meaning and the quality of what we are trying to evaluate. Knowing your why and using this as the basis of quality assurance changes the game, she said. As a field, we sit at the centre of a critical triangle that links citizens with learning and work, and that makes us uniquely positioned to not only help individuals, but to also influence systems in which they move across and within, making these systems more efficient, effective, and ethical. And as Deirdre pointed out yesterday, what has the pandemic shown us? The pandemic has, again, as she said, shone a spotlight on the inequalities that have been with us for a very long time. Those who were already marginalised have been hardest hit as a result of the pandemic. And the worse off that we're going into the pandemic, the harder it has been for them. She also made an interesting point around governments around the world tending to boil complex socio-economic, education, and labour market challenges down to skills deficits or mismatches. And she went on to say that fixing the current woes with the skills agenda is something that they have experienced in Canada. That if we just train people with the right skills and place them in shiny new jobs, then all will be well. But she went on to say that we have to move beyond the skills agenda. Not the skills are not part of the puzzle, but it is actually not the whole puzzle. And that career development lies at the heart of a full and sustained recovery. And she concluded by saying that career development is literally purpose-built to help people through complex and unpredictable life transitions, including the pandemic, which we're working through. Our theories, our approaches, and our interventions are exactly what is needed at this time to help people to survive through the pandemic and to move to recovery. I'd now like to invite our panel to join me. And we're joined this afternoon by three panel members, which I'll ask them to introduce themselves at the moment. And you will also see on your, if you're in gallery view on your screen, that the group that we're working with that's assisting us with this summit Together Apart, the scribe, Kate, who will be scribing today's panel session, and that will be available as a resource for attendees post the summit. So just to kick off this afternoon, I'd probably just ask each of the panel members just to give us a bit of an introduction of who they are and where they're working and where they come from. And we might start with you, Mary, if that's okay.
Thanks, David, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this panel and in the summit. I'm an Honorary Associate Professor in the School of Education at the University of Queensland, and I've worked in career development for many, many years. I've worked in schools as a guidance counsellor in secondary schools, in private practice and in a private career counselling service. and also most recently as an academic training people in career development and as a researcher. And so my research and writings focused on career theory, career development across the lifespan, and I've got a special interest in career development in childhood, and on qualitative and systems approaches to career assessment and narrative career counselling. So I've got a particular interest in the application of systems theory and systems thinking and to career development and how that might look.
Thanks, Mary. I might throw to you, John.
Thanks, David. So I'm really excited to be here with everyone. My name is John Woodend, and I'm a lecturer at James Cook University. And at JCU, I'm also the graduate certificate in career development course coordinator. So that's my main role there, along with teaching some of the subjects. So I'm originally from Canada, if you couldn't tell from my accent. And in Canada, I was trained in counseling psychology. So I did practice that ranged from academic, career, and personal concerns. And I worked primarily in secondary schools as well as with post-secondary students, so at university counseling centers. I also have a research portfolio. So for my research, I tend to look at the international career transitions of newcomers. So that's included skilled immigrant workers, international students, and the accompanying partners of international students as well, which is a very fascinating area to be in during these COVID times with border closures and international students locked out. So I'm very excited to be here with you all, digitally anyway, and to discuss Serena's talk. So being Canadian, I do know the program that she was talking about when she was discussing the 5 Ws. So I'm also excited to hear from Amanda and Mary about their key takeaways from Serena's talk.
Thanks very much, John. And Amanda.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name's Amanda McCue. I work as a private practitioner, and I work with adults, and I work primarily with, almost exclusively really, with the defence community. So with transitioning ADF members and ex-ADF members and their spouses and partners. And I've done that for a little while in the US and for a lot longer here in Australia. I came into career development probably from a slightly different means than a lot of my colleagues. I had been a representative for defence families and realised that the employment of spouses or partners was becoming an increasing concern. And so I thought, well, I will do something about that. So I went and did my grad cert in career development and have tried to build my knowledge and my expertise over the years. I also did a Churchill Fellowship on that same topic, which involved travelling to the US, the UK and Canada to learn about what they are doing. And so that's how I came into it. And so I work, I think, at the individual level, one-on-one with clients, but I also work at what I would call that sort of population level and looking at some of the systemic issues. My clients, like other adult clients, have many of the same challenges that you'll all be familiar with: transitions and unemployment and underemployment, the quality of employment and juggling multiple life roles.
Thanks, Amanda. So you'll see that we've been able to bring together a very diverse panel today, which will obviously lead to some fairly rich discussion. And again, just as I said at the outset, that we would encourage you to use the chat button to post your own comments and views and share them along with other attendees as well. To start our discussion today, I might just ask each of our panel members to identify what their key takeout was from Serena's presentation. And we might go in reverse order this time, if that's all right. So I might start with you, Amanda.
Thank you. There was so much to think about. One of the things that struck me as I listened to Serena's presentation is that she was really encouraging us and challenging us, I felt, to almost treat our sector like our clients. So she was challenging us and encouraging us to reflect and to be self-aware and to understand clearly who we are, what our strengths are, what our values are. She emphasised the importance of relationships and networking, of being proactive and visible, being open to opportunities and being adaptable, of communicating our value and quantifying and qualifying our accomplishments. So that was kind of my when I thought about it afterwards, or as she was talking, that's what I was thinking about. There was a couple of things that stood out to me that really resonated with me in terms of my work, and the employability dimensions were certainly one of them. So many of my clients come to me looking for job search assistance, and that's not surprising because that's a service I provide. But I think they're also driven there by referrals from other agencies and by funding models that emphasise job search services, and because that's what they know about us. But so many of them need far more support in those other dimensions that Serena described. And in the area that I work in, I see a big emphasis on job searching and on skills, and especially transferring and communicating those skills to employers. But unfortunately, I think there's a lot less emphasis on the other dimensions. And so I see a lot of missed opportunities to achieve the outcomes that I think that the policymakers are aiming for, and missed opportunities to get maximum return on investment. So part of our role, I think, is to communicate to the public and to the policymakers what we offer and the value of that. I really loved the emphasis on relationship building. I think as we pay more attention to the context in which people's careers take place, and we look at what the pandemic has created and exacerbated and uncovered, I think our awareness of that broad array of stakeholders is growing. And certainly in my work, when I did the Churchill Fellowship on military spouse employment, I mapped out the stakeholders, and the list is extensive. Serena made the point that career development is uniquely positioned to help individuals and influence systems, but I think we're also really uniquely positioned to connect those stakeholders together, because we see and we understand the many interrelated factors and the actors that influence a person's career. And the last point that really resonated with me was whether we are positioning ourselves as experts. And I think it's important to ask that if we're not, then who is? Because if there's a gap, it will be filled by someone. And I'm sure we've all got examples of policies and programs that aren't evidence informed or aren't designed, delivered, evaluated by people with the expertise that we know exists in our sector, and which research shows is effective. And just in the last couple of weeks, I've seen 2 jobs being advertised that involve providing career support to clients, but neither of those required applicants to have qualifications. And certainly, again, in the field that I work in, there seems to be a real focus on the number or the size of the providers and the programs, and very little on the quality of those programs. And so I think that risks creating the illusion of support and the delivery of poor support rather than actual effective support. So yeah, they were my main takeaways. But as I said, there was a lot there.
I'm sure we'll get to most of it, Amanda, so there'll be plenty of opportunity to unpack a bit more. John, what were your key takeouts?
So, I've only been in the Australian career development context for just over 1.5 years now. So it's really interesting on a general note to see some of what Serena was emphasizing in her presentation in the Canadian context where I was previously. So I had that in the back of my mind. But when Serena was going through the 5 W's, one word kept coming back to me, and that was access. And it stayed with me throughout. So I sort of organize my thoughts around the 5 W's and access. So, who is accessing services? Serena talked about who's knocking on our doors, thinking about who isn't. And I started thinking about who can't knock on our doors. So, for example, in the Australian context, you might have international students who were sort of welcomed pre-COVID, but now largely sort of kept out of the system. So, they can't knock on our doors. Are we thinking about them? How are we understanding their huge shifts in career and career choices and plans, things like that? For where and when people are accessing or not accessing, and again, not able to access career development services, that was another key idea I had there around, in Australia, continued focus on school leavers. I think there's a real importance to think about that period of time. It looks very different than what it did a year ago, but also now considering, alternative areas in the lifespan, which I think we've been pushing for. There's a renewed focus, I think, particularly if you think about the she session, as some people are calling it, where women are forced more into unemployment than men, is what we saw in COVID. That looks very different to their career development than what they would have anticipated before COVID. So for what people are accessing, a topic that came up in the panel yesterday that seemed to stand out is this overlap and the boundaries between career development and mental health. So what do career practitioners do in supporting well-being? I think it's a really important discussion that Serena pointed out, that we need to be crystal clear internally, but then on how we communicate that externally to the public. Where are our boundaries? Where are our areas of competence? And then finally, the why. So why people are accessing or not accessing, or again, not able to access career development services. We see in the news in Australia recently covering issues around casual work, for example, and in particular, universities not properly compensating casual workers. So are we just thinking about, people moving into employment because it looks good numbers wise, or are we thinking about how we can support people into decent work because it benefits them as well as society? So the why aspect around access. Those were my key points.
Thanks very much, John. And Mary, what were your key takeouts?
Well, similar points really to Amanda and John, but first point that I'd like to make is that after I listened to Serena's presentation, I really thought that it was very affirming for our field, and I found that really positive for me, because our field has been marginalised in, it's marginalised in schools and the settings where it's commonly found, it's marginalised in the community. And I found it very affirming to actually hear somebody provide a comprehensive overview, if you like, of the value of our field and what our field offers. And so I thought that positive affirmation of our field was a good thing. The other thing that I took away from it was how the issues, even though Serena mentioned a lot of Canadian examples, the international nature of our field and how issues that are present in Canada are also present in here and in other countries. And so, I thought about the international nature of our field. And, we know that Australia is an island, and that's served us pretty well in the pandemic. But as a discipline, we're not an island. And I think that we can share and learn from others internationally, but bearing in mind all the time that our context is different. So just as in Australia, when we developed the blueprint and the professional standards, we looked at what was available overseas, we Australianised, for want of a better word, those documents. I think another takeaway for me, and John sort of mentioned this, was Serena's words about that we need to be crystal clear about our scope of practice. And I think that as a field, we need a shared understanding of that, because Serena's employability dimensions really show us the breadth of our field, and people may work in certain sections of the field. And how do we have a kind of common vision that we can communicate within our field, but also to stakeholders and to clients? And I think that that's a really important point, because it goes to the identity of our field and its visibility. If people don't know who we are or what we do or what we can contribute, then we're going to remain peripheral and somewhat invisible. And we're not going to become part of the one-stop shops that Deirdre mentioned in her presentation yesterday, that, you know, career development could be part of a suite of services offered to people. So that was a takeaway, and I might pick up on some of that a little bit later. I think related to our identity is the term career, which can be problematic and reminds us that career development has been, is largely a Western concept, and we're not working with predominantly Western clients anymore. And even if we were, one size doesn't fit all. So I think we have to contextualize for client groups. So I think that that's an important takeaway. I think her point about opportunities presented by COVID, I think it is a good time for us. And she actually said career development lies at the heart of a full and sustained recovery, which I thought was a very positive message for our field. But we have to position ourselves so that we are part of that sustained recovery. So it goes back to some of the points I made before about how we do that. And I think also the other takeaway is, you know, and this has been a long-standing issue in our field, is the evidence base, which has been strengthened. And Serena's points about us, you know, being in charge of our data and making a story around that data, I think is really important in helping to improve our visibility, improve the identity of our field, and solidify a position for us in the post-COVID recovery. So there's some takeaways.
Thanks very much, Mary. I think one of the things that we also challenged our panel members to do is that obviously Serena's keynote presentation did an amazing job of capturing a lot of what we've discussed in the summary, and also what the key takeouts were for each of our panelists. But one of the reasons why we obviously used Serena and Deirdre as sort of, you know, experts in our field from an international perspective, we also wanted to be able to contextualize that in an Australian context as well. And, you know, I think it'll be interesting to hear John's views on this, obviously coming from Canada and having some time now in Australia, that a lot of obviously what Serena said in her presentation, you know, was very much focused on her understanding of Australia, but it was obviously very Canadian focused as well. And there's great learnings from that. And there's obviously some big overarching takeouts, which our panelists have already picked up on, in particular, the reaffirming nature for the field. But I'd be interested now in hearing from each of our panelists. We've called them silencers, but, you know, what were some of the things in an Australian context that you thought, you know, could have been picked up? I might start with you, John, if that's okay.
Absolutely. So there were many points. I could have highlighted some silences between what's happening in the Canadian context versus Australia. But the one that stood out to me was, you know, the necessity of working across professions, across stakeholders, to pull up relevant experience, and broadening the scope of who in terms of who are our clients and collaborators. So Serena noted this was somewhat missing in the Canadian context. And so I think it would have been interesting to see and hear more about, you know, the National Careers Institute, which is, you know, its role is emerging in the Australian context. And I don't believe it was discussed yesterday. I might have missed it on the panel. And the reason I thought of I recently facilitated a Q&A session for students with Laura Sham, the acting deputy executive director at the NCI. And one of the questions that students brought up was about how the NCI works with stakeholders, and in particular, how they balance complexities in the differing stakeholder agendas. And Laura seemed to really appreciate this question, and she sort of emphasized the importance of having diverse stakeholders. So whether it's national, state, territory, you know, clients, individual clients, researchers, theorists, employers, industry, the list goes on, and embracing that complexity working across the different needs and priorities of these stakeholders. And so she saw these complexities as supporting the field, and importantly, she was envisioning the NCI's role in taking leadership and helping to navigate some of these complexities. And so I'm a silence there is, I'm kind of wondering what, Serena seemed to point that out as missing in the Canadian context. Wonder what that influence is going to look like in the Australian context as we hear more about the NCI's role. So yes, so how important reaching out to others, seeing how that leadership comes through, along with leadership from other associations as well. So that was my key point.
Thanks, John. Amanda, what were some of the things that you picked up?
Well, similar to John, but I don't have John's benefit of knowing both Canada and Australia. But I think, yeah, that cultural context is what struck me around stakeholder engagement. So in my experience with the work that I've done, I have found that Australia is somewhat less collegiate and collaborative than Canada. And I'd be interested to know whether John thinks that is the case. So I think that influences, how we build relationships and who we work with. And I mean, as an example, the Canadian Military Family Services in their Department of Defence was gearing up to host an international military spouse employment meeting that was going to bring all of the countries together. And that was their initiative, and they were getting off the ground. It didn't happen because of COVID. But everything that I've had to do with Canada in that regard has been, I think, far more collegiate in that regard. So I wonder how, I think we need to have a conversation around whether or not it's how we build the relationships and network with other people. And I think along the same lines, I think when we're thinking about the relationship building and communicating our value and influencing policy, we need to think about who do Australians trust, and how do we gain that trust to become trusted experts. But I also thought that, it's worth highlighting some of the things that we're doing in Australia that relate to what Serena's presentation was about. And, we didn't touch on our CICA professional standards and our practice guidelines that, guide us both individually and collectively. And, for example, in the Career Development Association, CDAA, and I'm the president of the ACT Northern Territory Division, we are using those competencies to guide our professional development planning. And we've had a fantastic amount of PD available in our sector. And with the pandemic, we've had greater access to international perspectives. I look at the way we recognise and celebrate excellence in our profession with awards. We do reflect on who we are, and for example, CDAA hosted a great online forum based on Mary's paper about whether or not career development is a profession. We do have members reaching out on radio shows and National Careers Week. So, and I'm just thinking of Anne Villiers' position paper that went to the Senate inquiry on COVID-19. So, just to have a think about what we are doing and where are the examples of things that we could build on in the context of what Serena spoke about.
Thanks, Amanda. And Mary.
Yeah, I guess some things that I thought about that perhaps were mentioned briefly or not mentioned or triggered me to think of something a little bit different was related to the who question, and CICA's message about career development being lifelong and life-wide. And I don't know that came through strongly in the presentation, because I think we have to begin very early where stereotypes and ideas about what children are going to do when they grow up begin. So we need to begin very early. And that's not about children having to make decisions or anything else. It's about getting them some exposure to the world of work. And that also is important in addressing inequality when some children come from families that don't have exposure to role models. There's also a how question that I thought I would like to focus on, and that relates to context and remoteness and how we offer services and who services are offered to. And I suspect that in this country, if you live in a very remote area, you have much less access to services. If you don't have access to technology, you would have less access to services, etc. So I think when schemes and programs are brought in, they're often one size fits all. And I don't think that necessarily works. And in Deirdre's presentation, she talked about spaces and places. And I think we need to think about, well, maybe something different is needed here from what's offered there. And recently, I've been looking at something on communities, and the town of Woorabinda, which has an unemployment rate of about 80%, is actually developing a wattle seed industry so that they can sell wattle seeds in the first phase, at least, to miners to do their reforesting and upgrading of the mine site. But that's a community response to a career development issue, because they're hoping to generate employment in their community. So I think we can think more broadly about career development. I think there's also a point about the contextual nature of careers and the relational nature of careers that Amanda has mentioned about career and work occurs in families, it occurs in communities, it occurs in countries, and there are benefits for individuals and benefits for all of those parts of the system from career development. And it's not just about the skills agenda. There's much more, as Amanda was saying, that's involved there. So I think inequity was another point, and John's point about who can't knock on the door, which is related to what I was saying earlier. And even, and services are provided in traditional places like in schools or universities. But if you're not there, how do you get access? And if you can't afford a private practitioner, how do you get access? So I think that there are a lot of issues around equity and inclusion that relates to the social justice foundation of our field. And I think that there's an issue about who enters our field. And this gets back to our identity as a profession. And people enter our field with all sorts of backgrounds, which is not necessarily a bad thing. However, our field does have a history and a theory base and a research base that underpins the work that we do. And so I think we have to consider that. And standards have certainly helping with that in our field, but at the moment, not all employers, as Amanda said, are looking to employ people who have qualifications that meet the standards. So I think that they're important things that we need to think about as we move forward. And I did think that if career development services were part of one-stop shops where people could access maybe social workers and psychologists, et cetera, and career development, that maybe that would be an indicator that we were getting close to where we want to be.
So I might just pick up on that last theme, Mary, about this one-stop shop, because I think, there's been some reviews that have been undertaken recently that some of the findings in the reviews, if we have a look at, the Shergold review, which spoke about these career hubs, the Productivity Commission review, which spoke about career hubs. And I suppose in the theme of the focus of today's panel, which is about the future of career development practice, I'd be interested in your own views about how you might see that moving forward from each of you, about this notion of a careers hub where we are bringing aligned services together. Because and also how that works from a social justice perspective, because I'm just sort of reading a lot of the comments that are coming through in the chat as well, and there's been some really interesting comments around disadvantage, and I think it also picks up on your point earlier, Mary, about, you know, the system was very much created in a very different time. We're a very different society today than what we were back in the 60s and 70s, and how have we, as career development practitioners and in our practice, evolved to make sure that the services that we provide are actually mirroring the needs of the community that we're operating in. So it's broad, and I'm not going to pick on people, so happy for anyone to sort of jump in if they want to add to that.
Well, I guess I can start. I mean, I think it's not about doing something new. I think it's just about building on ideas and examples that already exist in Australia, because there are examples of one-stop shops that may or may not include career development now. And I think we, you know, in terms of Deirdre's comment about spaces and places, there's a comment in the chat about the hubs, as you know, with libraries and things like that. So I think it just needs to be thought through about what's accessible to people.
Thanks, Mary.
If I could just add to that, I think it relates to the relationships that we build with other sectors too. And so if I have a look at the veteran space, for example, there's recognition that there are multiple aspects to supporting a military member transitioning out of the military into civilian employment, because it doesn't just change their employment, it changes everything. And so there are providers already trying to do multiple things. I think being part of those communities that already exist is important. And that was one of the things that I was thinking about when Serena was talking. We do have stovepipes with stakeholders. There can be reluctance to you know, step on other people's toes. So I think that the hubs not only or the idea of a one-stop shop isn't just about accessibility for clients, but it's also about building those connections that we need in order to provide holistic services. And some of these organizations have already got the trust and the connection with clients. And so if we can join those in a collaborative space, then we do what Serena is talking about in terms of taking our services to clients rather than waiting for clients to come to us. So I think the one-stop concept offers something in that regard.
I'll just add to what Amanda was saying there. You know, in my practice, I do sort of work across several different areas. And so typically I've been housed in, you know, parts of organizations that is meant to collaborate with, you know, physicians, with psychiatrists, with, you know, social work type people as well as career centers and international student centers, things like that. And so, you know, it's amazing how many times I'll see a client and not know that they're connected with all these other professionals, and it takes an effort to coordinate that care. It takes additional effort that's, you know, usually not accounted for in my workload, for example. And so if there was a center where that was the expectation, where you could break out of those silos, where you could have those communities of care that, you know, really building on Amanda's point there, that you make a change in one area, of course, it's going to have ripple effects in other areas of your life. So how can we support the person instead of, you know, essentially hot potato, like, okay, I've helped you with this, here you go, take it to the next person. I'm not going to have anything to do with it.
Thanks, John. I mean, I think an interesting challenge that we're all sort of facing at the moment, sort of post-pandemic, is that you know, we know that traditionally career development services historically in Australia have been housed in schools, you know, young people's schools. The state and territory jurisdictions have taken control of that through what's run in schools. And, you know, even from our own surveys, we know that, you know, the large percentage of people undertaking roles as career practitioners are working in schools. But we also know that as a result of the pandemic and post-pandemic, that we now have, you know, still have 1.2 unemployed people in this country. And there's a crying need, I think, for greater access to our services from adults, and adults who have been impacted through no fault of their own of the pandemic. And, you know, I think it gets to Serena's point about skills and training. And I think, you know, CICA has done some work with states and territories around the provision or how they can better support adults who might want to access sort of career services. And we know that in some states that there are career services available in local TAFEs, but we also know that if you are completely unfamiliar with the TAFE system or the VET system, if you were actually find yourself now unemployed and you're university qualified, that a TAFE system is very foreign to you. And so it's a great challenge to get people to visit these centres if they're not actually familiar, or they actually don't view the value that sort of a VET system might provide in helping them re-engage in the workforce. I'm interested in the panel's views about how we tackle that, because I think as we move forward and we've got an ageing population and we know that people are wanting to work longer, but we also know that they're going to have to pivot in their careers. So some of them are going to have to make some changes. What role do we play, and how do we, you know, advocate more strongly in that space? John, you look like you've got some views.
I was just going to ask if you could repeat the question. That'd be great.
So it's probably, sorry, it's a broad statement without any specific questions, but I think it's very much around, you know, I think there's a recognition now that adults more than ever have needed to have access to our services of a career practitioner. But again, it's about that knocking at the door situation. So, and we also know that a lot of the employment services and the support structures that have been put in place to support Australians that have found themselves unemployed would not know about our services and would have a lack of understanding of the value that we might be able to provide. How do you think we tackle that challenge?
I'll go first, but I don't know that I have a clear answer on that, but it is making me think of, Mary brought this up, I think, and Amanda may have seconded it, that what I wrote down was, okay, so this affirming, re-energized perspective of career development. In some ways, I kind of see it, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, people were really putting all of their hopes on medical professionals, and, you know, people developing vaccines and things like that. And I think as we have vaccines roll out, the focus is really going to come back to career development practitioners, and the career development field in particular, to be the secondary savior in some way. So how are we going to do exactly what you're talking about, David? How are we going to support adults who might need to make a shift? How are we going to expand outside of secondary systems where typically the focus has been? And I don't know that I have an answer to that, but I really just wanted to emphasize my agreement with you that I think we are going to be, the focus is going to be on us and the field to start providing some solutions around that.
Mary or Amanda?
Yeah, I think one of the things with the pandemic and the skills focus is that support for people becomes more as a result of them losing their work or whatever, rather than normalising it for people to talk with career practitioners about where they want to see themselves in a couple of years, or where they want to see themselves, you know, how they want to upgrade their skills or whatever. So career development sometimes is sort of a reactive kind of service, in that we know that there's a problem, like kids transition from school, so we better do something about it, or people become unemployed, so we better do something about it. But a more proactive model where, and I think it gets back to how we're defined and how the messages that we put out there about the services that we offer, so that we can become more mainstream and less kind of reactive in crisis points, if you know what I mean. And the, you know, at the moment, the, you know, people with unemployment go to unemployment services, and those people won't necessarily be career practitioners. So, you know, I think either Serena or Deirdre mentioned people going, learning skills, but then coming back through the door again because it hasn't been a good fit for them. So how do we get built into the picture in a proactive way?
And I would second what John and Mary have said. I think it comes back to us being, and as Serena was saying, being very clear about what we do and who we do it for and what value that we add. Without having that very clear, it's very difficult to expect that members of the public will approach us or find us. So again, we have to be where they are, and so that's online, but I think that's also in spaces like libraries. I think, you know, local government offers up some great opportunities to connect with people where they are, especially for those that don't have the access to online. And I just had a thought that's just flown out of my head as they do. And yeah, I'll have to come back to that. It's just disappeared.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think, you know, and I think these are big questions, you know, not only for us today, but for the industry to answer, is that there is no one size fits all approach. It can't work, you know. So we know that, you know, going back to John's point earlier about, you know, how is the National Careers Institute going to play in this space, and what role will they play? And we know that they've moved in some spaces. So we've obviously seen, you know, some initiatives come out of the NCI. So, you know, we do have the school leaver support measure for young people, and we do have a grants program, and we do know that, you know, there's a whole lot of work in foot around that lifelong, life-wide approach. But again, how do they play in the space in a skills and training agenda as well? You know, so that, you know, that's an interesting thing. So I think, yeah, you know, I think, you know, a lot of people have been saying in the chat comments as well, is that exactly that, is that, you know, each of us as career practitioners tend to work in fairly unique circumstances, whether we are a private practitioner who works sort of in our own little niche field, or whether we're in a school or a TAFE or a university, wherever we work. It's about finding what works, I suppose, for our clientele and making sure that, you know, we deliver that. I think sometimes people believe that, you know, online is the answer to everything. And sure, you know, I think what COVID showed us was that we can obviously deliver far more services far more efficiently online than probably what we had thought we could do. But for a lot of our clients, it's actually not the answer, you know. So they don't have access to, you know, they might have poor internet, they don't have great internet, they might feel very uncomfortable having a conversation like we're having today, sort of face to face. It might not be that method. So I think we need to obviously make sure that we find, you know, methods that, you know, where we can sort of capture, you know, the requirements of probably the different segments of that sort of lifelong, life-wide approach. I'm going to throw out a big one, and, you know, again, this is about the future of career development practice. I'd be interested in hearing from the panel where you see the practice in 10 years from now. It's a big thing to think about, and obviously, if you think, I mean, surely if I asked this question 18 months ago, it would be very different to sort of what we're facing today. No one would have thought we would have been living through a pandemic, but we've obviously seen the profession, for those of us that have been working in Australia for a long period of time, have seen it evolve. And I spoke about it yesterday on the panel about sort of that roller coaster ride that the profession tends to go through, you know, ebbs and flows. But I do believe probably we are at a point now in Australia more than ever that we probably are far more progressed than what we've ever been before. And I'd probably pick up on the point, Mary, that you were saying earlier about, sometimes we lose sight of the fact of we are ground in theory and we are ground in research, and that must drive our profession and has to drive our practice. So I'm interested in people's thoughts about, and again, it's pie in the sky dreaming. So, but where you sort of see us moving to in the next 10 years, what are some of the things that we're going to have to tackle?
I think some of the things we're going to have to tackle are, I think it's realistic to think that there are client groups now, and some of these are emerging as a result of COVID, that haven't existed to a large extent before, particularly older people, who've lost their jobs, who maybe haven't had to apply for a job for the last 25 years, who really are completely displaced as a result of losing their job, and how we support them, how we support, people with disability who you want to be able to work to the best of their ability in jobs and support themselves, because it's good for mental health, it's good for social relationships, it's good for lifestyle, everything. So there are a whole group of clients that I think we need to be more prepared and able to engage with. More diverse clients where the starting point may not be the individual, it may be the family, where the first conversation has to be with the family rather than with the individual. So I think it's thinking broadly about, our client groups, and then going back to this issue about where some sorts of proactive, if you like, for want of a better word, services can be located, and they can be located in organisations. And in the chat somewhere before, there was about HR professionals and services, but it's probably more than HR. It's about how people access career development within their organisations. And, we've been having the conversation about digital approaches and hubs, etc. So I think there are big questions possibly around Serena's, 5 Ws about who our client group is. It's an expanding group, and there are groups that we haven't traditionally addressed their needs well. I think it's about the what we offer, which we've talked about in terms of clarifying. And, I guess I come back to the point that I made before. If people see us as one of the services that they regularly go to, like people regularly go to a doctor, regularly go to a dentist, if we saw in 10 years' time people thinking that career development service was something they would book an appointment with every few years, then I think we'd know we were really getting somewhere.
I think I would add to that. I'm optimistic. I'm hoping that with large investments in healthcare, I'm hoping to address the pandemic, people are starting to see the benefits of these investments, and we're going to see maybe a small golden age of innovation there, and I hope it trickles also over to our spaces in education and career development, and in technology. I hope if we can get our why, if we can get clarity around our roles, and we can clarify our why and get it out there, I'm hopeful that we can be an important player in that space. That's where I would like to see the profession head towards. Bringing in some of the things that we've already been talking about here today, of working in the system, working with others, what Mary was just talking about, expanding our understanding of who is the client. If we can clarify that messaging, we can clarify our why, we will strengthen our position and our role in this, what I hope is a golden age.
and following on from that, I think where we are in 10 years' time will depend very much on what we do with this opportunity. Both Deirdre and Serena and just about every PD conference that's been on recently has identified what an opportunity the pandemic has provided in terms of highlighting the important work that we do, but the importance of careers and people's career lives to just about everything. So I think it's what we do now. But I go back to the points that have been raised throughout today around, and in Serena's speech, about being very clear about what it is that we do and what we offer, so that we can then take that and project that out to the community, so that we can become those people that, you know, you'll check in with, you know, for an annual checkup or every couple of years, that you'll see career development in the same way that you know, might view financial planners, understanding that you need expert input. But I do think we've got to be really clear about all of those 5 things that Serena mentioned. And then we need to take that and to John's point about being innovative. These are opportunities. You know, to quote Churchill, never waste a crisis. Well, we've got to make sure that we don't waste this.
I think it's a really good point. And I think, you know, like as you know, you've all said, I think Serena's 5W framework is something very easy for all of us to be able to check back on every now and then in our own individual practice or wherever we work, sort of in this industry, about, you know, what those 5 W's are that she's talking about, to sort of, you know, to test that thinking, I think becomes really, really important. I'd like to switch now and just pick up a point, and there's a comment in the chat too that I noticed about, you know, that, and it picks up a little bit about Mary's point about standards and defining the industry and why we have the standards and why we have the frameworks that we do, and how we are embedded in theory. And we don't want to be seen as sort of an elitist group which doesn't allow other people in, right? So we have to be an industry where we are working collaboratively, but we also need to obviously, you know, create fairly firm boundaries and have an identity for ourselves. You know, so a lot of, you know, we start to see a lot of larger organisations, HR professionals working in those organisations with no specific career development qualifications, who are engaged in conversations with employees that obviously don't have the qualifications, but call themselves and see themselves as sort of career practitioners. And I suppose, you know, in my role that I sit in at CICA, I'm inundated with professional career practitioners contacting me, outraged that they've seen sort of, you know, ads being placed on Seek for, you know, someone to go and work in a large organisation in HR, to work in our space with no qualifications at all, right? Call themselves career coaches or whatever they choose to call themselves, which is fine. What are the panel's thoughts on that? Like, you know, how do we elevate that element of our industry? Because we have amazing standards. You know, they've just been refreshed. They're very easy to understand. We have very clear entry into the profession. You know, we have a registration process. We have requirements for professional membership of the association. How do we amplify that message? Mary, I might throw to you.
Well, I think professional standards is something that the field can be very, very proud of, actually, in some international settings, but here in Australia as well, because in about 2004, I think it was, when the OECD did a review, it was possibly the first time that the field realised, or well, not realised, but it was made apparent to the field in a fairly direct and strong way about the problematic nature of people not having qualifications, the way services were delivered. So the international review by the OECD into career guidance back then highlighted a whole range of issues that has really stimulated a lot of work in the field. And I think CICA in developing the standards has been really responsive to that. And then the further work that it's done in endorsing qualifications, etc. I think that that's something that we can be really proud of. And I think the fact that the NCI, when they advertised the position for the telephone career counsellors and wanted qualified people in those roles, is a sign that it's working. But I guess it's a question of how fast it works for people to realise that we do have standards in our field, and how we get that message out there further. And I think that that's still a challenge that we have in terms of letting the general public know that there are some people working in our field with qualifications and some people working in our field without qualifications. But I think it's a bit broader than that too, because our field and the sort of work that, you know, the sort of things that we deal with, you see a lot of resource developers and, you know, websites, et cetera, that can just be, you know, come onto the market. And I think we need to think about as well how is there a way that the industry can quality control some of those products and services that just emerge. And I know that the guidelines for services, career services and practices that CICA has is one way of doing that. But I think we need to think through broader than just the practitioners, the whole industry. And I think it's something like the aged care review at the moment are dealing with a lot of these issues about how you determine what's good and what's not in a field. And they're very hard questions to answer. And it's not saying that people who aren't qualified or whatever aren't doing a good job. They probably are. It's just, you know, how our field defines itself.
Thanks, Mary. John?
Yeah, so I think Mary summed it up pretty well, but this is not something that is just in the career development field, and we're seeing it in the chat. People give examples of psychology, for example. So, in Canada, I'm a registered professional psychologist, but people get confused with psychiatrists. They get confused with a number of different things, and because the messaging, I think, hasn't quite translated to that public space. And so thinking of Serena's point around getting our message right and then getting it out in the public, maybe we internally through the standards, I agree, they're very clear. Maybe we've got that internal messaging. Is it the external part? Is it, okay, we've got it internally, now we're getting it, outward. Are we delivering in that space? Those are sort of the questions that I'm thinking about. And, I don't think, so just taking, for example, HR professionals who maybe move into that space, I don't think these are necessarily bad actors. I think sometimes if people identify a gap, whether that gap is created due to need or legislative lack of influence, people will move into that space to address it.
Thanks, John.
I think we've got a responsibility to promote the qualifications and the professional standards. So I think there are small things that each of us can do to do that, to make sure that we let people know what our qualifications are and our experience, let them know that we're engaging in professional development. I think taking opportunities to proactively contact organisations that are providing services that may not know. And I think this is one of the, again, if people do not recognise what career development is and who provides it, then like John was saying, they'll see a need, they'll fill the gap, but they might not be not qualified or filling that gap with unqualified people because they think they can fill it with unqualified people. It could be more around they lack the awareness that there are qualifications, that there are professional standards, that there are quality benchmarks. So I think part of what we can do because we don't just care about our individual clients, we care about our clientele in general. And I think that means promoting high quality career development wherever we can, and bringing it to the attention of whether that's policymakers or organisations that are providing services. They may not know that they can advertise for qualified people. It may not be on their radar. So I think part of what we need to do goes back to that messaging about what our sector is and who we can help and who our clients are that Serena pointed out. We've got a role to play in promoting those qualifications and standards and quality.
So I think, you know, there's some really great points, and I'm conscious of time. I'd also be interested in how do we amplify our services, right? So we also know that there are people, not necessarily working in organisations, but if I think about, you know, parents working with their children, friends working with, you know, peers that might have lost a job, although they're not actually seeking the services of a professional career practitioner, what role do you think individual practitioners have in trying to sort of amplify or provide some level of support to those people to sort of have meaningful, what we would call discussions or career conversations, not actually going to the level of a formal, you know, career session with a career practitioner who's qualified. But we know that we're never going to be able to stop the conversations that occur around someone who, in the best interests of trying to help somebody, is going to give their advice and support. So if we think about sort of key and trusted sources of career information, what role do you think, you know, the industry or practitioners have in sort of directing people to those trusted sources? Because even as Mary was saying earlier, we have also seen an explosion of for-profit organisations moving into our space, delivering some of these services, and we know some of them are great and some of them could do with a bit of work. So I'd be interested in the panel's views on that.
I would just say, I think that collectively, I think working together is really important. I think the CICA member organisations, so like CDAA, putting out information where we can and doing it collectively. I think it's very difficult to amplify messages or get things out to reach policymakers as individuals. So I think it's really important that we're working together and looking for opportunities to do things together to amplify the voice.
I think also there's a point about providing good service, because I think, you know, I worked in a service many years ago and it was just beginning, but by providing good service, we got to put on more people and our name was known more, and the service grew and more people came and more people learned about the profession. So I think if we, you know, if practitioners are doing good jobs, then that helps grow our reputation and our field. But I also think that there are other influences in career development, like young people will talk to their parents, for example, older people will talk to their partner, their friends, etc. So I think there's a chance also for us as a field to help people have those conversations, have conversations with children, have conversations with adults, have conversations with somebody who's 60 and trying to think about where to next or has lost their job or whatever. So there could be very, sort of simple resources to support those people to have better and more informed conversations and pointing people in the direction of good resources rather than just the blind leading the blind. If the field can guide those conversations in some way, that could be another helpful way to, like resources for parents, resources for spouses, resources for employers. Those sorts of things could increase our visibility.
Thanks, Mary. John?
Standing out to me from both what Amanda and Mary have said is this sort of almost like systems, influencing the system. So it is easier to work directly with individuals. It's probably why we have had a large focus there. But then how do we get into that system space so that when parents are having conversations with their children, it is the information the field has sort of said is gold standard at the time, versus just their while may be helpful in some circumstances, anecdotal experience. How do we get that systems? I think it's a really challenging question. It made me think of Amanda's idea of yearly checkups. Like how do we normalize? I think Mary used that word. How do we normalize this idea that, you know, if you have a career change, you can go and speak to somebody and not have the stigma around unemployment necessarily. I don't know if I'm providing any solutions, but these are sort of the key questions that came up for me in thinking about that.
I don't think anyone's got the magic bullet, John, so I think that's fine. I suppose one more final question before I ask you to perhaps give some final thoughts before we close up this afternoon. I'm interested sort of in your own personal views about what innovation you might have seen in career development practice more recently that you'd like to share with our attendees. There's silence.
Well, I mean, in terms of innovation, and is it an innovation? I'm not so sure that it is. But I mean, one of the things that we all noticed during COVID, and I think we're not really post-COVID yet because COVID is still happening, but was just the move to digital, you know, providing services digitally and working digitally, and, you know, and that's not an innovation. I guess the innovation is thinking about how we can apply it in our field, but a lot more people have begun to provide services in those ways. So I guess there's a point about upskilling there, but there's also a point about access. And I'm also always mindful that there are people in rural and remote areas, people who are from different socioeconomic backgrounds or for a range of reasons don't have access to technology, don't have access to our field, may not even know that our field exists. So I think if we can think of as many different ways of getting to not just clients, but the population, I think that will strengthen our position.
Thanks, Mary. John or Amanda?
Nothing off the top of my head. I'm sorry, David.
So this is not necessarily an innovation, a development that I think, so in training people to become career development practitioners, one of the things I sometimes see in subjects where it's crossover with other helping professions, so counseling, for example, is sometimes there's this question around why am I even learning about career development? But I think this has been top of mind for people since the pandemic. So people are really seeing the influence of career on health, in particular, mental health in particular. And we're talking about both, and we're talking about how the two are linked to each other. And this is something that I'm always trying to stress to people, that we can't compartmentalize these different things. We've already talked about how there's a ripple effect across these different areas, but I think people get it now. I think people have had lived experience where they've seen it on a large scale, and we've talked about it as a society. And so I think that is a really important development that will free us up to talk about other innovations.
David, I think that related to this conversation about innovation, much of our conversation today has been, you know, present and forward focused, and you know, we can kind of get a bit down because we know all these things need to happen that aren't happening yet. But having been in the field for as long as I've been in the field, I get to look back, and I can see that we have things in place now that I only dreamed of when I came into the field. We have a whole infrastructure in Australia in terms of, the professional standards, endorsement of courses. We have guidelines for products and services. We have My Future. We have the NCI and all that it's doing. And they're all things that, even 10 years ago, a lot of that we were still dreaming about and hoping for. So, I really think it's about incremental steps, and we're building a very firm foundation to move forward on, and to move forward from. And I think that that's a good place to be, even though we want to be somewhere different. Ultimately, where we've come from, we're now better off than we were. So I don't know if that's helpful, David, but I think it's a point worth making.
Well, look, I think it's a really, valid point to probably make, and probably one to sort of, tie up the discussion this afternoon on, is that I think, when we all work fairly intimately inside the industry, sometimes we do lose sight of the fact about how far we've come. And I've not been in the industry as long as Mary's been in the industry, but I have been in for a while. And I think, when you're working as intensely as we do in it, sometimes we do get caught sometimes in the quagmire, and we do get frustrated about some of the things that we've discussed today. But I think if we go back to what all of our panel members raised at the very start, was about what Serena's keynote presentation actually provided for us, was a great level of optimism. And I think that, whilst there are some things that could be improved, and we should always look to improve, we should also recognise that, there has been some amazing leaps, especially in the last 5 years in this space. I think even as John could probably attest, in his role at JCU, the number of people that are investing in further qualifications, that are deciding to upskill, their qualifications in career development. And so, that's encouraging. So it gives me an opportunity on behalf of the Career Industry Council to thank our panellists very much today for their contribution. You probably will have noticed through the conversation, and I'm just going to pin or spotlight this screen for everyone. So today's panel discussion has been captured in a sketch format, and so that'll be made available as part of the resources post the summit. So what CICA will be doing is that post the summit, there'll be a couple of weeks after we've got time to pull it all together, there will be a communique which comes out from the summit, but there will also be a sketch capture of both of the panel discussions, and they've also been captured of both of the keynotes as well. So for those of you that have been asking about resources, that'd be valuable resources, they will be available for you. So that's great. So thanks to Kate. She's Kate from Together Apart, who I think that's a skill in itself to be able to listen to a panel discussion in an area that she's not familiar with and be able to sketch that. So Kate, thank you very much for your contribution to that. It just gives me an opportunity now to thank you all for your participation today. As I think if you joined us yesterday, you would have heard that over the course of the last 2 days at both of these Catalyst panel discussions, we've had over 1,300 people join us. So very, very big numbers, which I think is also a very good sign for the industry as well, that people are interested in coming and interesting to hear what people have got to say. So I think that's great as well. So on behalf of the council, thank you very much. And again, to Amanda and to John and to Mary, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us this afternoon. And to our attendees, thank you very much for your contribution through the chat as well. Thanks everyone, and have a great evening.
Thanks, David.